Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for day 5, our free Friday workshops of the BC Tourism and Hospitality Conference. My name is Mike McLeod, and I'm the Director of Member and Business Development for the BC Hotel Association. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It is my pleasure to introduce both Philip Monder and Krista Bax, who will be presenting Tourism Labor Strategy. I would like to first welcome Philip Monder, President and CEO of Tourism HR Canada. For more than 30 years, Philip has worked with labor market stakeholders across Canada and abroad, including foreign governments, pan-global organizations, Canadian and non-Canadian businesses, and various education and training bodies. His work spans over 15 industrial sectors and in 11 countries, with most of his career focused on the tourism industry. Philip is an industry representative to the Deputy Ministers Advisory Council, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Joining Philip is Krista Bax. She is the CEO of Go2HR. Krista has more than 20 years of experience in various strategic leadership roles. She was the Senior Vice President of Western Canada of Context, a strategic engagement and communications firm, and Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Gateway Skills Table. Krista also has extensive experience in occupational health and safety, primarily in the forestry industry. Thank you for joining us today, and over to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to just share my screen and, sorry. Trying to get to it. Sorry here. One again. Share screen. Here we go. Okay. Again, thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate that. I just want to make sure everyone can see my screen before I proceed. Looks like we're fine. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be co-presenting with Krista Bax from Go2. I will start the session today with about 15 minutes of time before I pass it on to Krista. Tourism HR Canada, of course, is a national organization with a mandate aimed at building a world-leading tourism workforce, working with stakeholders from across Canada, such as Go2HR and Tourism Industry Association of British Columbia. Collectively, our aim is to build a resilient, competitive, and inclusive labor market. And we do this by looking at the whole of tourism, which is defined by the 5 industrial sectors you see listed. So the tourism industry is one of the largest employers in Canada. Before the start of the pandemic, we were at 1.92 million workers, or just over 10% of the labor market in this sector alone. And the province of BC represented the 3rd largest in terms of numbers of workers in this sector, with Ontario and Quebec as the other provinces that employ a large share. Today, I have a large number of data slides, but this will be available to everyone afterwards. So don't worry too much about the detail. I'm going to use it as a backdrop to some of the key messages. So let's look at COVID for a moment. COVID hit us it was a hard hit. We faced unprecedented shortfall of workers impacting all tourism industries in all regions and in all ridings across Canada. In 10 weeks, by mid-April, tourism lost 882,000 workers. And by the year's end, tourism jobs had dropped to 1.57 million workers. That was from just over 2 million we had in February. In fact, in February, we were projecting some of the highest numbers of employees for the summer than we've seen ever. As of January, we are now at 1.4 million workers. And today, new data comes out for February, so we'll see what that number looks like, but we're anticipating a further decline. Now, I should add that I'm being brief with each of the slides I present, but much more depth of information and more detailed narratives are available on our website. And you may want to join us next week for the annual Labor Forum, where much of this will also be presented. Now, so there was the losses at that point. We had some recovery by August, and by the end of the calendar year, we had dropped by over 500,000. And here's what it looked like for BC itself. Very similar to pattern what we saw at the national level, proportionate to the share of workers in this province. Krista will be speaking more to the provincial numbers, so I won't spend time on the details. And in terms of total employment loss, tourism is carrying a heavy burden. This slide shows that the percentage of job losses due to the pandemic compared to the overall job losses in the economy. In other words, in April, those 882,000 workers that lost jobs in this sector represented about 1/3 of all jobs lost at that time across the economy. But by the time you get to December, you can see that the sector represents 88% of those still without jobs. So that gives you an idea of how hard we were hit and what some of the restraints mean. Just one more related note on this. This is data we just received yesterday. There were 900 businesses included in this survey with information collected in January and February. And 60% of those responding businesses had to lay off staff because of restrictions that were in place this winter. Now that provides some insight on why we see that the sector is lagging and indeed is one of the hardest hits. In terms of unemployment rates, as of January this year, we reached an unemployment rate of 18.6% for the tourism industry. That is compared to a very high unemployment rate actually in the economy at 9.8. But on average, in the last 12 months, we were approximately double the unemployment rate compared to the rest of the economy. And if I compare what that looks like in British Columbia, using those same lines, I'm now going to add what the BC trajectory looks like. Again, the tourism industry had a trajectory similar to the national data in terms of what unemployment looked like. But the other story here is that the rest of the industries in British Columbia fared a little better. In other words, there's a greater gap, which also explains, or maybe another way to put that is that demonstrates that tourism is particularly hard hit in this province compared to some others. Moving forward, I should also add very briefly that since February right through to December, these were the nature of how it impacted each sector. The biggest drop in employment was in accommodation and recreation and entertainment. And that probably seems clear or obvious given that those were the sectors most impacted by restrictions. Now, this organization also does do a lot of corroborating data to show what kinds of impacts or indicators are there to help us with forecasting. This is drawn directly from our website as a screen capture. And basically, you can see this one indicator of food service sales matches more or less the kind of scenario we saw with employment because, of course, it was aligned with business practice. Again, this is Canada, and this would be British Columbia, which is on a very similar trajectory. This data here comes from the National Tourism Indicators, which measures expenditures in various areas of the sector. You can see that in 2020, the overall demand was down for things like convention fees, travel services, recreation, transportation, all but pre-trip expenditures, which also may not be surprising to some because for the most part, what was allowable for people to get out and do things was basically outdoor. So camping, RVs were one of the only options available. These losses, by the way, are very significant. In our history of tracking some of this information, we have not seen losses of this scale. Other indicators we have, again, I was selective here, just show where the projections are going. This here is the projections on employment for the accommodation industry in Canada. And basically what this shows you is it's going to be late 2024 or early 2025 before we see numbers similar to what they were pre-pandemic. If you go to the employment tracker website that we have, you can get data very specifically for the province itself, for any of the industries as well. And this analogy can be carried over from a revenue point of view, which again shows you that it's going to be late 24-25 with current projections in terms of returning to where we were pre-pandemic. And one more projection slide, because this is of interest to everyone, but how long will it take us to return back to employment levels? Well, there are different scenarios because there are different matters here. But again, it's not until 25 and in some occupational areas, 2030 before we can expect to recover at levels that are necessary to meet demand. Moving forward for a moment, I just thought this might also be of interest. The blue bars show the seasonal adjusted number of employment insurance beneficiaries during the height of the financial crisis in 2009. At peak, just over 1 million people each month were taking benefits. Now, the black bars themselves are what happened during the COVID window in 2020. And there is a bit of a dip there, and that's because there were new measures that were added, like the Canadian emergency benefits that kicked in. But with EI kicking in and changing come September, again, you see that spike. And what did it look like for our sector? Well, there isn't data specifically on tourism level data for numbers here, but we do have a bit of a proxy with accommodation and food services and the arts and recreation entertainment. And bottom line, there was over 700,000 workers in accommodation and food services that have been subsidized in August, with more than 100,000 in recreation. Again, I'm only giving you quick data points here, but then how does this compare to the rest of the industries that we are tracking, or that is trackable through Stats Canada? Basically, you can see in the darker bars that tourism got its lion's share of people that were displaced. Now I'm going to shift gears for a moment and talk about the fact that we're very worried about supply. We know that many of the workers we've relied on and that are furloughed and have been displaced are not going to be returning. This is of great concern. And in fact, we expect that we're going to have larger shortages as we recover than we ever had going into the pandemic. Because of time, I cannot go through all of these, but we do have articles and details of these on our sites. But there are many factors that contribute to this. In fact, our current estimates are that perhaps 20% of our industry will retain their employment. Otherwise, they will move on to other roles, and a good percentage will simply not return. This is corroborated with additional data that we've had on doing survey work with regards to sentiments. This is something we've done 3 iterative times over the pandemic, most recently in January and February. The big headline here is that 50% of respondents noted they have a negative view of tourism, with 39% indicating it's more negative now than pre-COVID. There's lots of reasons for that, I might add. Whoops, what the heck here? Let's try now. Incidentally, health, well-being, job security are the biggest factors. This slide shows you from the undesirable point of view how much of a dip that's taken. Again, in the 28 years of our organization's existence, we've never seen numbers quite this severe in terms of perceptions and attitudes about the industry in an unfavorable light. At the same time, there's a lot of hope that we might add. There is some sense that tourism is important to the economy, so there is potentially light at the end of this tunnel. But at the same time, there's been a drop in likelihood of people recommending others to work in the sector, both if they've been in the sector before or if they've never worked in the industry. And the only 2 populations that we can rely on basically are new immigrants and visible minorities as our major supplies of workers moving forward. Of course, diversity matters, and we would go after as many other industry groups as we can, or minority groups as we can, but those 2 are going to be the lion's share of our workforce moving forward. I might add that young people will become less and less of a pool that we can draw from. What we know as well from COVID, and this is an area that's been asked of us frequently to respond to, is the difficulty in trying to recall workers or to deal with work refusal. Because of time, I'm not going to go into those details, but I encourage you to go to our site with information on these matters and tools that can help you. That will help retain as many as we possibly can. Finally, with the last few slides, I just wanted to move on to what we are recommending in terms of strategies to help restart the tourism workforce. Indeed, they fall into 4 major categories. There is a full report on this. I'm only going to cover the headline for each of these 4 areas, but there are 37 sub-strategies to this. In terms of supply, we know it is important to prioritize redeployment and re-employment in order for us to recover. If we do not, it will hamper growth and it will slow down the recovery itself. Most of these jobs are attributed to frontline occupations and minority groups that work in this sector. There are several strategies we recommend in order to do this. Some are individual, some are at the institutional level, some are policy. Of course, skills training becomes a major theme, mostly because the nature of work has changed significantly, as are the demands. And we've been able to track the kinds of changes we see in skills needed. But this needs to be a key investment, both from a government lens and an employment lens. The third strategy is around sentiment. This is a direct response to those comments we've heard about people not favoring the industry. It goes beyond workers, it's public and community-based as well. And our last section we have in our strategy, concerns the area of community-led models. This is my last slide, but I wanted to reinforce a point here that we know moving forward that enterprises must involve the collaboration with communities and governments in order to revive the workforce. This is not singularly business-led, it must be community-led. With that, I will pass this on to Krista. My deck does include a few other information slides just for information. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just asking to start my video and transitioning over. So bear with me for a couple of minutes. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Philip and Mike, for the introductions. Okay. So I want to just confirm that everyone can see the first slide of my presentation. I can't see any faces for nods. Oh, here we go. I see in the chat. Oh, there's Philip nodding. Thanks very much. Okay, so let's begin. Thanks very much, Mike and Philip. And I'm Krista Bax, CEO of GoToHR, and it's a pleasure to be with you here this beautiful Friday morning. I'm very grateful to be joining you from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, joining you that include the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where I have the honor to live, work, and play. I'd like to also offer my congratulations and appreciations to both TAIA BC and BC Hotel Association for hosting a great conference, throughout the week. I hope many of you had an opportunity to participate in a lot of those sessions. And thanks again to Philip for the informative presentation that we just have and setting the table to help us take a deeper dive into the labor supply in BC. Tourism HR Canada, does a tremendous job. As you can see, there's such a wealth of information that is relevant to every province across Canada, and it's been great working with them over the past year that I've been in this seat. So I'm just going to advance my slide. Okay, there we go. For those of you that don't know, GoToHR is BC's Tourism and Hospitality Human Resource and Health and Safety Association. And we really exist to realize strong workforces and safe workplaces that deliver world-class tourism experiences in BC. In this role, we empower employers to have, strong human resource and health and safety cultures that really support strong business performance. And we do that in a number of ways through offering programs that include tools, information, and consulting services to elevate employers' human resource and health and safety practices. We offer education and training for both the current and the future workforce. And we also are a resource to inform government and stakeholders on labor market conditions. A lot of the LMI that Philip just reviewed on a BC basis, as well as strategies going forward to ensure we have the labor we need to sustain the industry. And so for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to focus my comments, with a BC lens on the impacts of COVID and the road ahead as it pertains to the labor supply, because that's really an important aspect that we're all very concerned about. And before I dive in, I just want to, reflect a bit. Much of the conversation over the last 10 months has needed and has been focused on business survival, because if there are no businesses, There is no demand for labor, and supply is a bit of a moot point. And so, you know, we're still battling that, but, you know, we have an opportunity to, you know, draw our attention to the future. And BC's tourism and hospitality workforce has really been turned upside down, as you could see from a lot of the stats that Philip shared. And, you know, it's hard to really understand what they've experienced, what they're feeling in terms of their future outlook, and how they're planning going forward. We all know that these workers are key to providing exceptional experiences to everyone that walks in your door. And so let's take a look at the future of the labor supply. Okay, so before we you know jump ahead, I do want to just start with a snapshot of what our workforce looks like here in BC. Because when considering labor strategies, we really need to reflect on the makeup of the workforce, because it's important to understand that different audiences require different strategies. And a lot of all the figures that I'm using also come from Stats Canada. So pre-COVID, BC's tourism and hospitality industry employed just over 300,000 workers across 4 subsectors. And this accounted for 12% of employment in BC. This workforce number of 300,000 represents the entire tourism and hospitality workforce. The workforce that just supports the visitor economy is approximately half of that. But when we consider labor market strategies, it's important that we look at that entire labor segment. BC's tourism and hospitality workforce is a very diverse group of individuals. And what's important to note that you can't really see in those numbers and stats is that it plays a really important role in every community in BC. So who are these workers? Well, we can see here it's a gender balanced group. Tourism and hospitality has one of the largest employers of youth in BC, and represents a significant amount of the workforce at just under 30%. But the workforce is not all young people, and as Philip says, it's not a group that we can solely rely on going forward. Almost 40% of the workforce is between ages 25 and 45, and these are workers with families, with mortgages, and really important anchors in the communities that they live in. We can also see here that around 30% are immigrants or non-permanent residents, meaning individuals not born in Canada, and almost 28% are visible minorities, meaning persons other than Indigenous people who are not Caucasian in race, non-white in color. And 46% of the workforce has some form of post-secondary education. So that really sort of, gives some perspective of, the perception of, and only entry-level workers and low-skilled workers that often come in the terminology when we talk about the workforce. And when half of our workforce has post-secondary education, there really is a lot to offer. I also want to take a couple of moments this morning to just look at a couple of key important labor segments. Tourism and hospitality provides important employment opportunities for Indigenous peoples here in BC and across Canada, particularly for young Indigenous peoples. And you can see here that 28% of total Indigenous employment in BC resides in tourism and hospitality, and it makes up over 5% of the total workforce here in BC in tourism and hospitality. And 40% of these are young workers. And Indigenous tourism has an incredibly important role in the BC tourism ecosystem. And over this past year, many Indigenous tourism businesses remain closed for 2020, which has had a real impact on the workforce. Indigenous Tourism BC is at the tail end of a really great Indigenous tourism labor market research project and resulting strategy, which we are grateful at GoTo to be invited at their table to participate. These are the type of initiatives that will help support targeted efforts for unique audiences to ensure that we have the workers that we need to realize recovery. Oh, there's one other one I wanted to look at here. Let's see here. Sorry about that. Now, building what off of Philip shared, and an image that we're all very familiar on, and you can see the significant drop of, and this is BC data, you can see the significant drop of tourism and hospitality employment in 2020, where employment was really cut in half, and then we saw recovery, as we progress. And this is a really good indicator in terms of what's happening. But I want to recognize that there's a lot happening in the background of these numbers that we need to consider along when we look at these type of stats. And this graph does not represent a mirror reflection of industry recovery or industry health, because there's a lot of things that we have to consider when we look at these numbers. The wage subsidy and other support aids, that helped many of these jobs, come back, were put in place. And, if those aren't in place, it's hard to think that those numbers are going to stay the same in the current environment without modifications of restrictions going forward. These changes, reflect employment or number of jobs, and it's really hard to see the number of hours included in each of those jobs. The nature of the full and the part-time work. And it's also really hard to see the regional differences that we know have been stark here in BC. We know that downtown accommodations did not necessarily realize the same type of summer as some of the resort communities in the interior and on the island. And at GoTo, we're working at better understanding and tracking these figures through recovery as part of our recently announced LMI project, generously funded through the BC government. And so when you look at a chart like this and you're thinking about labor supply, it suggests that there's a surplus of workers, and so labor supply shouldn't be an issue. And right now, in the research and the conversations that we're having, employers aren't really experiencing, real recruitment challenges today. But there is a real concern about sufficient labor going into the future, going into this upcoming season and into the future, for a number of the reasons that Philip mentioned. And due to a number of factors, we do have to anticipate a labor shortage going into the future. So now I want to shift gears a bit to talk about some of the challenges and issues ahead of us. And on the screen here is a list of the pre-pandemic HR labor market issues that we have identified, and ones that you have likely experienced firsthand for yourselves. In many cases, COVID-19 has either significantly worsened some of these issues or even slightly altered or put a different, spin on some of them. For example, Philip spoke about the perception issues with workers. Layered on now is the uncertainty, the instability, and the safety that the industry offers over the next couple of years. We also know that physical distancing protocols have made infrastructure issues with housing and transportation worse in some communities, which has the impact on ensuring sufficient talent on business teams. And, on the small to medium-sized businesses, we all know that they have traditionally, lacked in internal, HR expertise and capacities to support fulsome recruitment, retention, and training strategies. And these challenges have just gotten significantly worse due to, the pandemic, because, all of these teams have decreased. You've scaled down to the bare bones, but, there's increased demands coming at you from all sides. There's one pre-pandemic challenge that I do want that I believe has a new context that I'd like to just highlight, and that's the competition for workers from other sectors. When the workforce was cut in half in April of last year, the future was uncertain and government supports were unknown at that time. And we were all very concerned about ensuring people could pay their bills And at GoTo, we in early efforts, we supported, the connection between unemployed workers with in-demand sectors that were responding on the front lines of the pandemic, and that included, long-term care, healthcare, delivery, and agriculture. But as support for businesses to bring back those workers started to be mobilized, as well as unemployment supports for those that did lose their jobs, we really turned our attention to supporting the restart protocols, business assistance in responding, and maintaining some form of worker attachment to the industry. And, I think when we look at the supply, we can all agree that tourism and hospitality equips our workers with invaluable skills. And unfortunately, with the help of COVID, many of those sectors are now seeing and recognizing the immense value of our talent. And typically when a sector is in a tight labor market, they look to other sectors that might have a surplus to solve their short and long-term supply problems. And that's, part of where we find ourselves today, where with other sectors, looking and planning recruitment activities for our talent. And it's times like these that governments at all levels are very interested in terms of how they can support employment for all, and with the overall goal of lowering unemployment, because that's important to our province and our country's economic health. And while we can't disagree that and interfere in a person's needing to make a living and working outside the sector, or oppose government supports to foster employment, we really need to be aware that of the attention that our temporary detached workforce is receiving from other sectors that want them and need them. And as an industry, we need to be aware. We need to be concerned and actively monitor. Another important labor segment in the industry is our international workforce, and our industry relies on them to meet our needs, as Philip shared earlier. Whether it's here in BC from the BC PNP program or the temporary foreign worker program, the working holiday, or even the mobility francophone program. And with closed borders and quarantine requirements and unemployment rates high, this international labor supply was disrupted last year. For example, back in the spring, the PNP program temporarily suspended invitations for just over 30 tourism and hospitality occupations. And here you can see some of the impacts on permanent resident admissions year to year. Good news was last month that the BC PNP resumed inviting these workers back to apply to permanent resident status, and it was a policy change that we welcomed at GoTo, as we recognized this pause in the program impacted workforce stability. And we're also, with that change, we're partnering with the BC PNP and Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada to offer a COVID-19 update webinar in April. So watch for that. This session will help employers understand the impacts of these changes for their employees and their businesses, as well as gain an overall COVID update for the province, for the provincial and federal foreign worker programs. The temporary foreign worker program and working holiday visa programs are also important programs in our industry. And in the spring, they did have a pause and have resumed. For the temporary foreign worker program, they've resumed for essential workers only. But it's the uncertainty, the global uncertainty around the pandemic and travel limitations and 14-day quarantine requirements really did present a hurdle, which was a deterrent for many. Tourism and hospitality workers were not considered essential, so that really put some limitations over the past year. The working holiday program did pause and now reopened for some countries. But due to the travel restrictions, candidates now have to provide proof of a valid job offer to receive an invitation for the 2021 season, which removes a lot of the organic job placement that could happen after an individual has arrived. And so all of these changes around the international workforce disrupted the supply for the past year, and we don't really know the full long-term impacts. As Philip noted, the international workforce will and has been and will continue to be an important element of our labor supply. And as we noted earlier, young people are an important segment of our workforce. And we're hearing from some post-secondary institutions that student enrollment is significantly down for tourism and hospitality programs, some as much as 40% compared to year over year. For the last year, the majority of post-secondary institutions offered courses online, and some students questioned the ROI on that mode of delivery. We had good news here in BC that many of the post-secondary schools will be resuming in person in the fall, so that could offer a boost to our enrollment activities in those programs. And many of these programs have large international student populations, and the travel ban has had a significant effect on those students, participation and their parents, willingness to plan trips to Canada. And I think until travel, advisories and restrictions are modified, we should probably expect a little bit more of the same. And this pipeline, as we noted, is very important to our sector. And so, ensuring that we have this post-secondary cohort in the supply pipeline, we need to really consider strategies to foster and help that develop. And so communication strategies to share the progress of the industry's restarts is going to be important, as well as sharing good news and news about new investment that may be an innovation that could be coming down the line. I know I'm always surprised when I hear of an airline that's made a purchase for a number of planes going into the future, and I've seen some cancellations. I've also seen a couple of purchase announcements as well. And scholarships and loans tied to studying and employment in the industry may attract back this audience, or financial partnerships with employers to facilitate the hiring of co-op students. All of these are a few strategies that we'll need to consider to stimulate these educational programs. Again, and it's really important that we don't forget that, tourism and hospitality careers need to have renewed visibility in high schools too. I have a couple of other points I just want to touch on here. Worker mental health and wellness. There is not a discussion that goes by when we're talking about the impacts of COVID and the recovery strategies needed as an industry that meant the mental health and wellness of workers is not at the top of that list. And we know it's a real issue, and one that's going to be around with us for some time. We know that mental health disorders do not discriminate and can affect everyone, from frontline workers to GMs to the whole gamut of the workforce. And really the uncertainty, the instability, the safety and the demands of the workplace are really taking a toll on our workers. And like I said, we don't know the totality of those impacts. The last data that we have around at the workplace in terms of WorkSafe BC claims around mental disorders, is back in 2019. We don't have 2020 numbers yet, and that was at 6%. And I think we can anticipate that being much higher going forward. In the research that we've been doing, we've been hearing that anchor employees, are calling it quits, and they're making the decision to really take the opportunity to shift their careers. Some that may have been considering coming into the sector are making the decision not to enter altogether. And you know, many who have been grinding it out, you know, from a mental health perspective, have been struggling in silence, and we really, you know, need to support these workers that make our industry possible. And you know, there's, in terms of that magic bullet solution, there isn't one. There's a multitude of responses that are needed. But the one thing that we're doing at Go2HR is collaborating with the Canadian Mental Health Association on an initiative that will see targeted mental health supports to the tourism and hospitality workforce in the upcoming years. So if you joined Monday's conference session on this topic on Monday afternoon, you would have heard some of this, and it was a very engaging session. The Canadian Mental Health Association are great partners, and we're grateful, you know, of their attention and their focus on our industry that has been really the hardest hit as a result of this pandemic. WorkSafe BC is also working to provide a number of supports and resources for employers that we're collaborating with them on as well. So looking ahead, you know, listening to that, there's a number of hurdles ahead of us to overcome when ensuring a labor supply to support recovery. And what we have just covered probably sounds real bleak, but I guess I'd offer a bit of bright side and try and, you know, connect with those optimists in the audience here today. You know, there's a couple of things I just want to highlight and note, and the first thing is BC has always been and will continue to be a desirable place to be. And even with the high cost of living and all the challenges that come with it, we are a beautiful province, and many people want to experience it beyond a vacation. We also have top post-secondary schools that attract youth that may want to, you know, continue and settle here in BC. And the other thing I'll just sort of, you know, tack on here is that, you know, we need to consider what the societal impact of the pandemic has had on our society, or has had on our society. And that has really caused many of us to rebalance and reprioritize our lives. And, you know, in the past, many people narrowly looked at a career with a narrow evaluation. And I think in many cases that has broadened and accelerated that broadening of prioritization over the past year. And, you know, with some strategic positioning, I really think tourism and hospitality could be a beneficiary of this change of mindset within individuals. So looking ahead, Philip talked about a number of strategies to support workforce recovery, and we fully support all of these strategies. As you could see by the end of the slide, I sit on the board at Tourism HR Canada, and I'm pleased to be there and was a contributor to those strategies. But I want to just highlight a couple of things that we're doing here in BC with Go2HR. And we're also working to ensure a sufficient supply for the industry. You know, we're considering both short-term and long-term tactics as we go about this. We're working to maintain workforce attention and a connection. So when those opportunities are there, there's some ease coming in. And we're finding new ways to support businesses with recruitment and retentions, you know, and real practical supports. As we've noted, everyone is operating at reduced capacity and increased demand. We're also working to contribute to safe environments for everyone, for workers, for customers, and for communities. And if you joined the conference throughout the week, you heard Minister Mark earlier this week share that Go2 is leading the development and delivery of a safety training program for tourism and hospitality to ensure foundational health and safety knowledge across all businesses, which will overall increase the confidence of workers to come back to work, customers to start visiting businesses again, and communities to receive visitors again safely. You know, we're working hard at that, and that'll be available later in the spring. And finally, we're looking at ways to support employers to ensure that they have the trained teams that they need. And beyond safety training, we're really looking at expanding our training offering beyond our popular Superhost program suite and Food Safe to fill some of the training gaps in the industry that we've heard. And, you know, through this last year, the traditional training environment has really accelerated its shifting to online delivery, and we've done that too. And micro-credentials continue to be a more important role in our sector. And so we're going to be looking at that as well. So with that, I'll end there. I want to thank you very much for your time. And, you know, I just want to extend an offer out to anyone on the line. You know, GoTo is the BC's Tourism and Hospitality Human Resource and Health and Safety Association. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and give us a call.
Krista, Philip, thank you so much. Not sure why I can't start my, oh, here we go.
Okay, let me stop my screen here.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Krista and Philip, for the presentation. It's certainly a lot of things to think about. And as both of you mentioned, certainly some hurdles to overcome here, particularly in the short term. We do have a few minutes for questions. So I would invite anyone on the line to submit questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen there. And we'll throw those questions to our panelists. For you both, I think, just to kind of get started, you know, we've heard a lot about consumer sentiment. And one of the themes that ran through both of your presentations was sentiment about workers. And you know, is the tourism and hospitality space an attractive place to work? So can we dive into that a little bit deeper? You know, are there some things that the industry can do from you know, that above the basics that will make it more attractive to work in or to pursue a career?
Yes, how about I start with that one, if you don't mind, Krista. You know, when you look at the sentiment survey work that we've done, it's quite revealing on a number of fronts. Some themes are things we've heard for a long time, well over a decade or better. You know, there's always going to be a certain percentage of people that would not, sorry about that, view the sector as that interesting or that lucrative. But the ones that we have always attracted, and I think will continue to attract, are people that see an ideal fit for lifestyle. For example, we've always served as a major safety net for new Canadians, or for people who are gaining their first Canadian workplace experience, or for individuals that are entering the workforce for the first time. In fact, without us, most people would have not received the kind of experience or footing in their jobs anywhere else. So we will continue to attract a certain percentage of people with that in mind and with those particular needs. What I think is really been, I guess, highlighted by COVID is that there's a strong push and a strong interest in individuals having a very tailored work experience. You know, it runs parallel to me, this thinking as you would serving your visitor. You're serving your own staff person, if you like, and identifying what it is that's going to accommodate their respective interests. So they may now be having to care for family, or they may have health issues, or they may have other factors that need to be accommodated. And I think that means that the workforces will look quite different. Not to complicate this, but I want to add one more thing into the mix here, because I think it really it helps, I guess, speak to some of the challenge here. We believe moving forward that there's really two kinds of workforces for the most part that businesses are going to have to work with. One is what we would call their anchor staff, or their traditional sort of core of staff that we're probably most familiar with. And so that group of people is going to require a lot of professional development, supports, training, etc. But in order for the sector to recover, because of the shortage of workers and because of the flexibility that's required and the need to be able to scale up or scale down as required, we also think that there's going to be a fairly large emergence of what we would call the freelance workforce or ancillary workforce. Now, we saw some of that beforehand, right? So when you get to your question of attracting, there's really two different narratives. There's the one of maintaining and attracting the core or anchor, and then there's a whole other business model around how you manage the freelance. Now, I could go on this, but I'm taking up most of the time we have for the questions and answers. But I would encourage everyone to also go to our website where we've done some work on this, survey work, some studies, and have a little bit of guidance and tools that might be of help.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks, Philip.
I think Philip, highlighted a lot of important points in those two segments. And when I heard that question, I thought of something. I went to a different angle in a different place, and I thought, okay, about attracting, at least in that short term right now. And a lot of it is going to be based on communications with the workforce from those businesses, because when workers are making a choice, like, they need to understand the environment that they're coming in, because there's a lot that it's always changing, and there's a lot of unknowns. So communications around, okay, what are the business plans? When might you be opening? To what proportion? And what can they expect? And even though, like, you may not know, and that's your best guess, I think that's really important for employees to know. So that communication, the communication about the safety protocols and how you deal with things, if you've dealt with something in the past and what you've learned, and just really giving that visibility to the priority and the awareness about that. And building off of something that Philip said about the two different profiles there, the flexibility. Everyone's life is not normal, and they may have somebody that they have to tend to that's be sick, or that somebody in their household may have to have traveled across the border, and there's a 14-day quarantine in their household. So all of those things about flexibility and understanding that things aren't normal, and an employer's willingness to work with them, just as they're willing to take on some of the risk and modifications depending on business demand too, I think is really important.
That just reinforces the point about the survey work. There are basically three real reasons why they're choosing not to return. There are many, but the three big ones are concern about safety, concern about health, and precarity of the employment. So really the way to counter this is to respond to all of those. And I think Krista's examples are exactly how that is done, giving some assurances on how you're tackling those issues and what you are able to do. And that brings a lot of comfort to people, and assurances that, that there is something at hand being done, that it's not just accidental. So again, it's the safety, it's the security, and some assurances of predictability with employment.
That's great. Thank you both for very thoughtful answers on that. This sort of as a follow-up question from our audience here, and Philip, I'll start with you on this. You referenced an anchor staff member. So could you describe the type of professional development you believe anchor staff require?
And I thank you. I think that's a very insightful question. Again, just to reflect for a moment over the last 10 or 12 months, for the most part, the anchor teams that have been held on to tend to be those that have had more experience, have been are longer tenured with the companies, and have basically more skills, because businesses have had to be very lean with who they maintain in their workforces because of financial reasons. But at the same time, they also need the highest level of flexibility with those teams. And so they're relying on people with autonomy and more skills for the most part. However, moving forward, and in fact, part of what we saw in COVID, but indeed moving forward in this next year, there's going to be a great need for continued professional development and reskilling and upskilling in a whole bunch of areas. We've identified some 9 or 10 major skill areas that are very different than what people would have been working on before. The complexity is there, and in order for businesses to recover, their staff are going to need to be skilled up in those areas. Now, I'm going to use one as a very perhaps easy and obvious example, and that is around the whole digital media management of these things. your online presence, how you manage those communications, being able to do with your consumers online, new product development online. There's a whole thematic area here of the whole digital presence, which was very different pre-COVID. So those anchor teams, which the ones you're really relying on in particular, are going to need to be upskilled in those areas. That's one of several examples. But I don't want to lose sight also of the other ones. The freelance workforce too will need a certain amount of training to attach them. In fact, they will have choices on where they go work, and you're going to be competing for those workers too. So you want to provide them with opportunities for professional growth and development, help them build their resumes. That's how you will get them in the door as well.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add one point about that on the digital skills and capabilities needed for businesses. I know that that's something that DBC has been working hard, and if you joined the conference earlier in the week, you heard about the Digital Marketing Academy that they're offering and making more accessible, and I think that's going to help fill some of those gaps.
Excellent. Thank you both for the answers there. We do have a few more minutes for questions, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom if you'd like to participate. We do have a few more here to cover off. I think this is going to be, the sentiment issue is going to be one that's going to be our biggest hurdle in the short term amongst some of the other challenges that we have. But this one goes back to that. How do we strategically attract talent to prepare for recovery when the dominant messaging in the media now is travel shaming and no essential travel? And we're dealing with hotel closures or partial closures.
We have been really struggling with the way a lot of these things are characterized in media. The villainization of the industry, for the most part, has really created some of the reasons why we're seeing a larger sort of anti-sentiment move happening. Will that go away once people get vaccinated? Will it go away once some of the other economic sectors start to recover and people see a little more hope at the end of the tunnel? Perhaps. But one, at the root of all of that is getting our public officials to change their narrative and to reframe their language very carefully and to stop with the messages that villainize the sector for the most part. And I'm being a bit harsh there, but those are exactly the words I hear from our board members and what we hear from the survey work. So it definitely starts there. But it needs to be more than that. We need to do much more work to communicate what the sector has to offer. We've been very strong in pushing messages around how tourism is a destination for employment, not just for visitors. Simple things like making sure that when we have images showing what the product offer is, like the vistas and the kinds of activities people can engage in, if we start to see workers in those images that are also happy and look like they're really enjoying what they're doing, these kinds of messages, although subtle, might also make a big difference. The reality is there's a lot of people that work in this sector that really enjoy it. It's not that all sentiments are negative per se, but we do need to do a lot more to elevate those messages that show why it's a destination for employment. And I do think in the end that there's a good number of people that will be attracted to it. But we're at a low right now, right? I mean, they've been through a lot of stress, and it just does not help when nearly every day in the media there's some message that would have you second guessing your choice of coming into the sector.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that, it's, we're in a very unique scenario over the next, 6 to 12 months as restrictions start to ease, as travel starts to open up, as we start to get back to normal with meetings and groups. And I think demonstrating the strong performance and the ability to keep workers, customers, and community safe is going to be important in that.
By the way, this is why in our messaging, one of the big things that we feel strongly about is that most of this effort has to be a community-led initiative. I mean, we're not going to recover our workforces unless we work at a community level, and it's directly in response to what Krista just said. If we want to regain confidence and change the sentiment, it's because we take a leadership role in bringing back to those economies and those communities the kinds of activities that they engage in and see as very positive. And so, you know, we need to be very much in the communities and helping drive some of this change and attracting the industry, attracting people to the industry as a result, not just for business, but also for employment opportunities. In fact, one of the 4 pillars of our strategies is very firm on this point of community-led approach. And it comes back to one of the earlier questions about skills. You know, from a business acumen point of view, we're very certain that business owner operators need to hone in on skills for community development and building, because that's how they're going to get some traction in changing that sentiment and attracting not just visitors or consumers, but their workers. Remember, that's more and more scarce out there, especially in rural Canada. And so if you're competing in a community for that scarce resource, you better be a beacon of opportunity and show some leadership.
You know, speaking to that, and I know we have some folks that are on the presentation here that are in rural or resort communities that have numerous issues around mobility, transportation, housing, those sorts of things. Are those the types of advocacy efforts on the local level that they should be getting involved with?
Yeah, you know, in a lot of the destination development strategies and plans, there have been, you know, depending on communities, those issues have been identified. And in some, when you look at them, they do have that infrastructure support that's needed, whether it's housing, whether it's transportation. So it is on a community by community basis. And, you know, those are areas that, yes, need to be identified and championed at that level.
Great. And again, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom. The notion of competition came up in, I think, both of your presentations, but certainly in Krista's. Competition with other industries, competition with each other in this industry. Practical question here: are there, you know, what's the best suggestion in terms of use of different platforms for recruiting and hiring and posting jobs?
Well, you know, to put a plug for one of the tools that we have on our platform is the job board. And, you know, those numbers over the last year from a job perspective, you know, were a lot lower than we've seen in the past. And the good news is we're starting to see those grow again. And those employers that participate and post jobs on our job board have seen really good success. So, you know, there's a lot of different platforms out there. You know, that's one that, you know, may not be on the radar of some, and certainly one to try. But, you know, it's, I think, you know, as I get back to, there's different strategies depending on different audiences that you're trying to attract. So you really need to consider that, because, you know, there's so much customized communication channels nowadays, whether it's on the digital, you know, side of things, that you really, you can't just spread your efforts and hope that, you know, they will come. You really have to think about, where am I going to, you know, potentially find that labor and target your efforts there. So if it's, you know, an entry level job, where should you post there? If it's in a certain community, what's the prioritization there? You know, do you expect somebody to be able to move to the community for that job? And so thinking about those type of things and the platforms that you should use, I think is something to consider.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Krista and Philip, so much. Valuable time and expertise today. We really appreciate your participation today and throughout the week. So thank you so much. And I'd like to invite all of our participants to stay on for the